So it's done.
So it's done.
We have one person on Zoom now?
Nope, nobody.
Oh, nobody. Okay. 3 people registered on the Zoom, so maybe one person or 2 people will show up on the Zoom. Were you able to drop the presentation in the chat for anybody who shows up? Okay, cool. Thank you.
She's in the conservation.
Oh, conservation section. Yeah.
When I start wearing makeup, I really confuse.
It wasn't that there are so many conservation commission members I work with, and I just don't see them enough.
Well, I guess we could start here. If anybody comes in, they'll have plenty of seats to sit in. So welcome, everybody. First of all, thank Zoe and the library for letting us come here and have our meeting here and helping set up and the tables and chairs and whatnot. So thank you, Zoe, for that. We also have Conservation Commission members, Vicki Brown, Julie Ostenchuk, and I'm the chairman of the Conservation Commission. Adam Brass and Gordon are also on our, Gordon Powers are on our Conservation Commission, but they're on it. Cal Bodwell was going to come, but he came down with COVID in the past few days, so he's not able to be here. But we do have Jeremy here to help us out with our presentation here today. Jeremy's a senior conservation project manager and farmland coordinator for the Southeast Land Trust. So what the East Kingston Conservation Commission has done over the past year or so is we prepared a natural resource inventory for the town. It was done a number of years ago, but we updated it and added a lot of information there. The natural resources for the town are birds and animals and trees and wetlands and things like that, which are significant to the town as preserving our rural character. And that's the reason why not only the natural resource inventory is done, but also the master plan is updated periodically. And so that's why we got involved in doing the natural resource inventory to help the planning board, which is challenged to do and update their master plan. So that's all going to be part of it. And over the past number of years, we've done a lot of conservation easements on properties. We were able to work with landowners to put their property in conservation easements and preserve open space. Right now, we have about 9% of East Kingston, about 600 acres conserved. And we're looking at hopefully working it up to 25% of the town to be conservation easement. I mean, obviously, we're not going to prevent development or prevent people from doing things that they want to do with their property or maintaining them within the family. But if they are put into a conservation easement, then they're preserved forever as conserved land. There are many benefits to open space and conservation land, farming, agriculture, public access, wildlife habitat, drinking water protection, healthy forests and scenic views. So there's a bunch of material here, that booklets and stuff that you can take with you before you leave, and designates some information on that. One of the handouts that is actually on our website, it's called "Does Open Space Pay?" And it's one of these type of things. It's on the websites. And it's a study done on abutting towns using cost of community services process. And what that does is for each given year, revenues and expenses for properties are done for town areas, for the residential sections of the town, the commercial sections of the town, industrial sections of the town, and open space. And so they looked at what the revenues for each are versus what the expenses would be, or expenditures for each of those items. And when you think about it, open space does not generate much tax revenue because it's just there for open space taxes. So there's not much revenue there, but they don't have any services required for the towns either. So the results of that show that residential land use is often cost communities a lot more than generating revenues. So it kind of shows that open space protection is vital and does have an economic justification for maintaining open space.
Can I interrupt you for 2 seconds?
Certainly.
We're getting you're very faint. So if you could just come this way a little and keep on talking, you're good.
Keep on talking?
Yep.
But what if I don't want to talk? So we've been working on with a number of people and talking about conservation easements. We had another meeting like this in the past, and we had Hal Bodwell was here talking about, he preserved a lot of land in Kensington on his property, and he had some very interesting comments about that and some stories which were pretty neat to have. So we are lucky to have Jeremy here tonight, this afternoon, and he's been instrumental in helping work with us on for the past few years, and not only our town but in abutting towns on conservation easements. So it's worked out pretty well. So prior to joining Southeast Land Trust, Jeremy worked for the Natural Resource Conservation Service in New Hampshire and received a master's degree in environmental services from the University of New Hampshire. While at UNH, he wrote a book called Sustaining Agriculture in the Granite State and The Citizen's Guide to Restoring Our Local Foods, Farms, and Independence. So Jeremy grew up on a small dairy farm in New Hampton, New Hampshire, and continues to help his family operate the farm, which sells raw milk, yogurt, and a variety of cheeses. How do you do that and still doing what you're doing now? That sounds like a lot of work for your family. So with that, I think, Jeremy, if you want to step in and give us some information on conservation easements, that would be terrific.
Yeah, feel free to jump in if you have a burning question. I'll try to get through the slides fairly quickly so we can have a lot of Q&A at the end. This is a picture of Hal Bodwell's farm. Actually, once I heard Hal got COVID, I tried to take as many photos from that project as I could and threw them in the slides here so people could get a taste of Bodwell Dairy Farm if you're not familiar with it already. The barn you see back there is a late 1700s barn with a mid 1800s addition. It's been around for a long time. The project, because I'll reference it a number of times, this is an aerial view of the property. And the way the Southeast Land Trust did this project was we actually broke it down in 2 phases, a south phase and a north phase. The primary dairy farm is on the southern side, but they do use, and you can see there are a lot of fields and land area that are used by the farm on the north side too. And when I talk about the financials of conservation easements, I'll explain why we actually decided to split this one up into 2 phases. So just a basic primer on conservation easements, if you're not familiar with them. Every conservation easement may look a little bit different. They're tailored to the property that you're dealing with and to the landowner's desires for the permanent protection of that property. Conservation easements, I like to describe them as falling on a spectrum. They can be donated, which prioritizes the landowner's objectives and can usually be completed more quickly because the land trust or the conservation commission isn't having to raise money to pay the landowner for the conservation easement. On the other side of that spectrum is a conservation easement that is purchased at full value. And those are the projects like Bodwell Dairy Farm, where they can take upwards of 3 years to raise the amount of funds necessary to purchase conservation easements. And I'll talk a little bit about how we value conservation easements later. The other thing that's important to remember when I talk about landowner objectives, if you're donating the conservation easement, we can really focus in on what your long-term objectives are for the property. It's going to be a permanent conservation easement, so that's a long time. The Land Trust and the Conservation Commission will have input and involvement in making sure those restrictions are something that we agree with and something that we can enforce forever. But we work closely with the landowner to make sure that we're in synergy with our objectives. When you get onto the other side of the spectrum where the conservation easement is paid for at full value, oftentimes the grants that we're using have certain requirements and restrictions that come along with the monies. So when you think about a donation versus a full fair market sale of the conservation easement, there's a little bit of subjectivity and prioritization that may be lost the further down the spectrum you move towards a purchase conservation easement. And that's just because there's public money usually attached to that. We have to make sure we're benefiting the public. So things like public access, people, one of the first questions I get is, will the conservation easement require me to open the land up? And the answer is it depends. If you're using public funds and the town, for example, really wants to get public access for the amount of money they're spending, some towns require that, other towns don't. So it just really depends, and that's all part of the conversation and something that, if you're working with me, we'd be talking you through and making those decisions along the way. We do a lot of farmland protection. That's what Bodwell Dairy Farm was focused on. We also worked with the Conservation Commission to protect Monahan Farm just up the road. But there are a lot of other reasons that Dennis mentioned why we protect land, from public water supply to recreational land, like with walking or biking trails. Specifically for wildlife habitat, there are some properties that may have an endangered species that use them, and they're protected simply just to keep development away from that really rare or significant habitat. And then obviously scenic or historic properties and properties that really capture the rural character that folks like to see in New Hampshire and that we're losing a lot of. So conservation easement, like I said, it's a permanent thing. If the land trust holds the conservation easement, we're out there once a year, every year, walking the land, walking the boundary to make sure that the land is being used in the way that it's supposed to be used and not breaking any of the conservation easement terms. Oftentimes the restrictions that a conservation easement places on the land doesn't impact the way a landowner manages the land at all. I would say if Hal was here, there's not very much that has changed on his commercial dairy farm since we put the easement in place. But it does depend on the type of funding you're using and the restrictions that come along with the conservation easement. And like I said before, easements take time. Even with a donation, it can take upwards of 6 months. It's a real estate transaction, but it's even a step up from buying a house with a small property. There's a lot of due diligence that comes along with it, and I'll talk about that shortly. But I think Dennis covered the benefits of conservation easements pretty well, so I won't harp on that. This is a picture of Hal Bodwell in the barn. And first step, I was really happy to see the Conserving Your Land publication over here. If you're at all interested in conserving your land, definitely pick up a copy. This is a book that myself and a number of other conservationists put together a number of years ago, and it's really meant for the landowner to help walk you through the process. It's a guide that you can always look back on because these easements take a long time. So you may want to look back on something or revisit it just to make sure that you're doing everything you need to be doing. The land trust is going to walk you through the whole process, but it's always nice to have that guide handy. Like I said, I think it's always a good idea to reach out to your local land trust to start the process. You can start with your Conservation Commission as well, but if it's a project that they think the land trust can help with, they'll probably ask you if it's okay to pick up the phone and call SELT. And that's how it gets started. From there are a lot of questions that we'll be asking you. So I was talking with a gentleman earlier that, there are two ways you can do it. Conservation easement means we're going to place restrictions on the land, but you continue to own the land. You continue to pay property taxes. If you were to pass away or you wanted to sell the property, you could do that. All of the proceeds go to you. If you're not interested in owning your land after the conservation transaction takes place, you can also sell the land outright. And depending on whether that's something the Conservation Commission wants the town to own, or it's a property that the land trust would be interested in owning, that's a conversation we'll have. The land trust, certainly, there are a lot of properties out there that we don't want to own. So it has to be a special kind of property that really brings benefit back to the community or wildlife in some way. So, but that's a conversation we can have. So that's really your first decision point as a landowner. Do I want to put a conservation easement on the land and continue to own it? Or am I sort of at the end of my ownership and I want to just know that the land is protected, but I'd like to move on after that? Who the easement holder is going to be if it is a conservation easement. Like I said, the Conservation Commission holds easements and they monitor them. Some conservation commissions are trying to get out of the easement holding business because it takes a lot of time and energy and responsibility to monitor those easements every year. So it depends on the Conservation Commission's preference. But Southeast Land Trust, we're always accumulating easements. We do 10 to 15 projects a year. And we feel like we have really good capacity at the land trust to monitor those easements long term. So there are a lot of expenses that come along with the conservation easement. It's even if you're donating the easement, we still have to do due diligence, which I'll talk about, but there are expenses that you might not even think of until you're at the table with us and we're talking about the steps that we have to take. We always encourage every landowner to work with an attorney of some kind to make sure that they're being counseled and represented in a way that doesn't feel like we're pushing them in any one direction. We want them to be able to make an independent choice and have good counsel. We'll put together a plan if it's a property that is a high priority, either from the town's perspective or from the land trust perspective. We'll sit down and we'll make a plan and figure out how to protect that property. I'll talk a little bit about fundraising and grants and how that comes into play. And like I said, we'll talk about due diligence, which is a process that does take time. So actually, I kind of covered this already. That's just a nice shot of the cows moving from one pasture to another. So like I said, every conservation easement is a little different. They're all written differently to be written specifically for the property that's being conserved. The Southeast Land Trust has our own model conservation easement, which it's sort of like a template. We have all of the conservation goals that we are looking for already drafted out. The restrictions are drafted out, but there are areas that can be customized for each property and for each landowner. And there are things we call reserved rights, which in some situations, I'll just use one example. Let's say you have a leach field and a septic system in a part of the property that we really want to see conserved. Even though we generally don't want to have improvements like a septic system on the conservation easement, we would prohibit them. We would have a reserved right for the landowner to continue using that septic system to replace it in kind. So there's an opportunity if there are very specific needs that the landowner has to write that into the conservation easement. They can be flexible up to a certain point. If we're particularly if we're doing a purchase conservation easement, Because these projects can take 2, sometimes up to 3 years, we do sign a purchase and sale agreement. And that's really just protecting the land trust and the Conservation Commission and everyone involved that's spending all of that time to be sure that we can conclude the project successfully. You know, some grants can take upwards of a week for me to write the application. So, you know, the land trust is a nonprofit and we just can't spend 200 hours on a project only to have the landowner change their mind right before closing. So we do often sign purchase and sale agreements just to codify the deal. There are tax advantage for donated easements or the value, which I'll talk about in a little bit. If let's just say you're selling the conservation easement, but you're willing to sell it for 100,000 less than it's worth, there are federal tax incentives that can help essentially pay you back for the value that you decided not to cash in on. There's also, we call them exclusion areas, but if there are certain parts of the property, like where your house is, where you just don't want a conservation easement, you don't want to have to check in with the land trust, we carve out areas, we call them excluded areas that aren't part of the easement. So whether that be an acre around your house, or, you know, with the Bodwell dairy farm, they had a lot of farm infrastructure. I think we cut out somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 acres there. So really, you know, we try to limit that, but we also want to make sure that the landowner, whatever they're doing on the property, they have enough space to sort of have their own personal space to work with.
Can I jump in on that, Jeremy? So when Hal was here in June, he talked about that. He said probably the hardest thing for him, one of the hardest things was figuring out which parts of the conservation easement to exclude for housing or whatever. But that was a thing that actually he said Dwayne himself and Jeremy helped him with to kind of figure out where he would want to make sure he wouldn't have to have, you know, easement area.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you know, Hal was really great. That was one of the things he struggled with because he felt like, well, I'm making a decision that's going to last forever. It's going to impact all the future generations in my family or future landowners. So he really struggled with that. And I think, you know, we made the best decision we could in that given time frame. But, you know, honestly, you may think the land trust wants to pinch that excluded area down as tight as possible so that we can conserve as much land. We know firsthand that sometimes if you make it too tight, you end up just having a lot of headaches working with that landowner and trying to make sure that they didn't build a deck somewhere where they shouldn't have, or didn't build a shed somewhere they shouldn't have. So we counsel and encourage the landowners to really think about how much area they might need around their house so that the conservation easement doesn't interfere with something they're doing personally. So this is just an example of how we calculate conservation easement value. We use appraisers that are qualified to appraise conservation easements, and they often call it a before and after analysis. So what the appraiser looks at is the value of, let's just say, 100 acres with no conservation easement on it. And these are just totally random numbers, not Bodwell numbers or anything. The property of the 100-acre property before the conservation easement is worth $500,000. Then the appraiser does an analysis and looks at what the property would be valued if it did have a conservation easement on it. So it's before the conservation easement and after the conservation easement. Clearly, a landowner selling a property that's restricted in some ways won't be able to obtain as much value on the open market as one that is free and clear, can be fully built out and developed. So the difference between that before and after value is the conservation easement value. Bargain sale is a term we use for an easement that's sold at something less than full fair market value. And in this case, the example was, let's say the easement was worth $300,000, like in the example before, but the landowner agreed to sell it for $100,000. That may be a personal decision they make. It may have something to do with the federal tax incentive. There may be an advantage to them being able to use that $200,000 that they're not getting paid in order to write off some other taxes. That's something that the landowner works separately with a tax advisor or accountant on. But whatever the case may be, that easement is being sold at something less than full fair market value. And there's value to that. And the current federal tax incentive allows a landowner to deduct somewhere between 50 and 100% of their adjusted gross income for a period of somewhere between 5 and 15 years. Meaning, if you, in this case, if you did a bargain sale for 200,000 less than it was worth, if you weren't able to write off that full 200,000 in the first year, you could carry it forward until up to 15 years. Depends on the situation a little bit, but you know, that's something that we would, the Land Trust or the Conservation Commission would speak with you about. The landowner may make that decision to do a bargain sale because financially it makes sense. It may also come down to the Land Trust or the Conservation Commission does that easement appraisal, and let's say the easement is worth 500,000. I go back to my office, I calculate a budget, and I think about all of the grants that I could apply to be able to bring $500,000 to the table. And the best I think we could do with all the grants available out there is $200,000. I would share that with a landowner. I would say, you know, these are all the grants that are available. I think we could bring to the table $200,000, but that's all that I can see that we could bring to the table. It would then be the landowner's choice. You know, do I want to move forward at that value? I'd be able to use the federal tax incentive, but it's ultimately the landowner's choice. There's no time in this process where you're forced into doing anything until that point at which we put a purchase and sale agreement in front of you. And then, you know, we're very clear. We encourage you to work with an attorney and make sure that you understand all the, you know, requirements that purchase and sale agreement has. But everything up to that point is, you know, just us working with you, trying to get an important project done. Talked about the appraisal, but it is a step that we try to do early on because, you know, you don't want to do too much ahead of that. Otherwise, you may find that appraisal either is way lower than the landowner expected, or it's so much that the land trust knows there's no way we would be able to reach that number. So having that number is really important, and having it fairly early on is important. So the landowner, the land trust, or the Conservation Commission doesn't get 2 years into the project and then realizes that, you know, the numbers don't align and the landowner, you know, needs to walk away. So it's something we do fairly early on. I already talked about the purchase and sale agreement. We do title review, and that's to make sure there aren't existing restrictions on the property that may impact the conservation easement. You know, with any kind of restrictions on a property, they're recorded in the registry of deeds, and whatever is recorded first recorded, first right. So if there's something recorded before the conservation easement that affirms a right to develop the property and the conservation easement comes in after that, the conservation easement, you know, isn't good for anything because that other right or that other restriction is in place ahead of it. So that does come into play if a landowner has a mortgage on a property. You need to be able to make sure that the lender that holds that mortgage is either willing to allow the conservation easement to take place, or is willing to release some of their rights in that mortgage so that the conservation easement would have priority over that mortgage. And I won't go into more detail than that, but there are a lot of different ways that we can work around a mortgage. So that doesn't in any way prevent you from doing a conservation easement, but the amount that mortgage is may have an impact on whether we can do it or not. We also do something that's called a phase one, but basically it's a company that does a hazardous record search to make sure that there hasn't been some chemical dump or spill or something that may be affecting the property and may be a long-term liability for the land trust or the town. usually, I've never run into a case where there's actually a spill on a property, but I have run into a case where there was a brownfield site uphill basically of a conservation easement that we did have to walk away from. In this case, there was some extensive research on where that chemical was leaching and it was headed towards the property. And so it didn't make good conservation sense to spend money on that project. So that's something we do as part of the due diligence process to make sure that, we're investing public dollars in good conservation projects. And then a boundary survey. We do this, I would say 95% of the time, unless you have a really recent survey that we can use. It's really important for us as the land trust to know exactly where that boundary is, because we're going to have to defend that boundary forever in the future. So if there's a boundary survey that was done when you bought the property in 1980, more than likely we're gonna have to update that boundary survey with the latest technology and make sure that it's defensible.
So the appraisal and a boundary survey and trust pay for all that?
So yeah, that's a great question. And it depends. So the way I talked about that spectrum going from a donation to a full sale of a conservation easement, sometimes that has to do with how high a priority your property is for conservation. And if it's a high enough priority and the land trust feels like we can go out and raise money through grants and foundations to pay for the easement, 9 times out of 10, we're going to raise the funds to pay for all of these project costs. But it doesn't always happen. There are certainly situations, especially on a donated easement, when we're doing things more in the interest of the landowner's objectives. The landowner may want to do the easement quickly, and we simply don't have time, or we don't have a grant source to go to. And then we'd have that conversation with the landowner and say, this is something we would like to do, but we don't know where to get the money from. And again, it's ultimately going to be the landowner's decision whether they want to move forward and pay for those costs. The Conservation Commission has been a great partner, and the Conservation Fund has been something that's allowed us to do good conservation work. Some of those funds have been used to cover project costs like this, but it just depends on how much money is in the fund, what grant sources we can raise. A lot of times we'll do a public campaign, meaning, we'll either through social media or through a letter writing campaign, we'll seek private donations. So there are a lot of different places we can go to look for money, but ultimately, we're a nonprofit. We don't have $1 million in the bank. We have to raise funds for every expense we have. So project size, I mentioned that I get back to this. Sometimes you're dealing with such a large property that there's simply not enough grant funds out there to cover the whole cost of it. And for a variety of reasons, strategically, it makes sense to break it up. And that was the case at Bodwell Farm, really large property at over 300 acres. And, they were both farm projects. We went to, I think, 9 different funding sources to get this project done. And there simply wasn't enough money in those grant resources to be able to do it all at once. So we broke it up into 2 different phases. I'd say that's relatively uncommon, but I just wanted to point it out because there may be a landowner here that has a 500-acre property, and it may be a situation that we have to do it in phases. It's also important to understand, people have their properties under lots of different ownership structures. Either they own it individually or through a trust or through an LLC. We can do a conservation easement on any type of ownership structure, but a conservation easement, if you own multiple tracts, they have to be under the same ownership to be under one conservation easement. In other words, you can't own one tract in a trust and another tract as an individual and do one conservation easement across both of them. They have to be under the same ownership. And most of the time, we don't allow subdivision of the property after it's conserved. There are some cases with farms where we make an exception. We actually did that with Bodwell Farm. Because again, 300 acres, if that's not a dairy farm 100 years in the future, but there are 2 vegetable farmers that each want to buy 150 acres, we want to see that land growing food. So we don't want to stop a deal that could break the property in half and have it still be productive and producing local food. So there's an allowance in certain farmland cases, but most other conservation projects don't allow subdivision in the future. Just real quickly about fundraising and grants, I already mentioned it. This was an example of an online fundraiser that we did for Bodwell. The money really comes from everywhere. I think I have, this is an example of all the different funding sources we tapped for to conserve the Bodwell farm. But
What part of the Moose Plate grant do you tap into?
what part?
Yeah, under what, there's a lot of subsections.
Yeah, so in this case, I'm imagining what the grant application looks like. We fell into multiple categories, but it was the portion of the Moose Plate grant that contributed towards project costs essentially for the conservation project.
No, I know, I'm sorry, I'm not wording it correctly, like, the Moose Plate grant covers multiple areas of the government, like, there's the library has Moose Plate grant money.
Oh, okay.
So-
Yeah, it's through the State Conservation Committee.
Okay.
Yep.
That's,
Yep. But as you can see, we really have to, on big projects like this, we really have to cobble together funds from so many different funding sources. And it's not just as simple as getting 50,000 here and 100,000 there. The funding sources have different implications, different matching requirements. Some funding sources can only be used for the easement purchase, while others can only be used for transaction costs. So I say this just so that as a landowner, you understand that even if there are enough funding sources out there, we still have to make sure they match correctly, and we still have to make sure that the expenses that we're tallying are eligible under that grant program. And that's all something that we talk you through as a landowner, but I just say that because it's kind of a complicated process when you think about it. But at the end of the day, you're protecting a property forever. So it's going to be complicated. It's going to take time, but the reward is knowing that your property is protected forever. So I think it can be really worth the process. I think that's all I have. So love to answer questions that may have come up.
So when you mean protected forever, that's from development.
Correct.
But what about logging and other uses? Because my property in particular, I would like to see go over Oldwell if I can. To,
Yep.
And there's Southeast Land Trust around. So I'm looking at, okay, what do you mean by that? And then the other question I had is something that I'm not sure you can answer, and that's the legalities may change later when water comes up on the coast and people move inland. And based on, I'm rather cynical and old, and looking at what government does, and what do they call it when they take it, eminent domain, I think they call it, and say, well, we have people we need to take, it's too bad with the rest of it. So
Yeah.
is there anything in there that is really,
Forever.
Forever means what?
Yeah. All right. So let me answer your first question about logging. Generally speaking, Southeast Land Trust supports working lands, meaning agriculture, forestry, well-managed forestry is acceptable under our conservation easements. We still require best management practices. We still require that a licensed New Hampshire forester draft a management plan to ensure that the type of forest harvests are done in a sustainable way. If a landowner has a desire to never do any cutting on their property ever again. In the land trust community, we often call that a forever wild easement, and we have done those in the past. But generally speaking, even forever wild conservation easements may have some allowances for cutting. For example, if there's a forest pest that arrives that simply is going to devastate the forest and perpetuate the pest, a lot of times a good forester can get in there and remove the trees that it might impact and hopefully stop its spread. So there are certain instances, even in a forever wild easement, that we may make an exception. But that conversation would be, directly with the landowner, trying to understand what your goals are and what our limitations are in terms of, we wouldn't want to stand by and watch a forest be devastated by a particular pest, but we'd have that conversation with you and try to accommodate it. The question about forever is a great one. All conservation easements in New Hampshire have what's called condemnation, termination, and extinguishment language. And what that says is there's nothing out there, no conservation easement that is protected against eminent domain. That's something that, the government and our common law system, it's built in. If it were to happen, what happens is, if for example, if you lived along 125 and they decided they needed to expand that right of way another 50 feet, they would either condemn or extinguish that additional 50 feet of the property, but the conservation easement would be retained everywhere else. But it's something that when the enabling statute for conservation easements was put into place in our state, it made exceptions for eminent domain and other reasons. There's an example up on the Saco River when we had the really bad flooding up there. A farm was wiped out. The river literally decided to carve the farm out and turned it into an island. At that point, the area that is underwater and now the main stem of the river, the federal government who held an agricultural easement on that property decided to extinguish that portion of the easement because it just simply was never, it was never going to be dry land again. But those are extremely rare cases. I think the conservation easement is the absolute best tool that we have right now to protect land forever. I can't say in 200 years that something else might come along that would extinguish them or trump them, but it's the best we have right now.
Can you talk about the advantages of a conservation easement versus putting it in a deed, putting languages in a deed for,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, oftentimes landowners have a question about deed restrictions. So essentially what a deed restriction is the landowner works with an attorney, goes to the Rockingham Registry of Deeds and records terms that restrict the property that they own. One of the biggest mistakes or misunderstandings about those restrictions is there's nobody there to enforce them long term. And even if, let's say you granted your neighbor a right of way across your property, well, the neighbor has that right of way and, they can't terminate it. Even if the property gets sold to someone else, you hold that right of way. But if both landowners forget about it and decide, or this landowner decides not to enforce it anymore, then it's essentially gone. And that happens more frequently than you would think as deeds pass from landowner to landowner. A lot of these things get lost. And so if there isn't someone there to enforce it, like a land trust, it's only as good as the party that holds that restriction and is only as good as they want to enforce it. Working with a conservation easement, you're working with a land trust or a town that is going to be there forever. We're kind of a unique, land trusts are kind of unique organizations because even though we have multiple departments, there are lots of different things our land trust does. Our stewardship department has essentially an endowment that's been built so that it will always provide spin off enough interest so that our land trust can go and monitor every property, every conservation easement that we've taken on. So it's really built to be there forever. You know, whether the other endeavors of the land trust are there in 100 years, you know, budgets come and go, but our stewardship department is built to withstand the test of time. So it's really, again, you know, there is no exactly 100% perfect solution, but it's the best thing we have right now.
Jeremy, I'd just like to say that there was a lot of flexibility, and I know you covered a lot of this, and thank you very much for your presentation. It's very informative to everybody, but I think there's a lot of flexibility also in the easements. If you put your land in conservation easement, and I was involved with the survey in Kensington for the Kimball Farm, and part of it was on a hill, so he wanted to make sure that that area on the hill, there's a half an acre or an acre up there that would be available someday if the family wanted to put a windmill there, or any solar panels or anything like that, and also to utilize that land for the possibility of some sort of a educational center or whatever. So there's flexibility in what you can do for your land, just like Jeremy says, that makes it really appealing to the family and to what your goals are, and how the land is very sensitive to your needs from the family from that perspective. So yeah, it does have a lot of flexibility. So
Yeah, and that's increased over time, I would say, as opposed to the other way. You know, we're understanding, particularly with farms, you know, agriculture evolves over time. We may not have been thinking so much about renewable energy back in the 80s, for example, but we are now. And the conservation easements have evolved over time to have allowances for that kind of thing. Farm viability is a huge buzzword right now. And so in addition to the typical types of agriculture you might think of, the Bodwells have the ability to do what's called agritourism, where they may be bringing people to the farm to buy their products, but they may have some other commercial activity. They may be selling ice cream, or you know, have some other commercial aspect to their dairy farm business in order to bring people to the farm. And you know, there's lots of flexibility that can be built into these conservation easements, even aside from farms, like Dennis mentioned. We're doing more and more conservation easements that allow different types of outdoor education or outdoor recreation. I protected a farm over in Stratham, right up against Stratham Hill Park, and it was really important to the town that we allow bicycle use on there, and cross-country skiing, and you know, all different types of recreation that may not have been appropriate in another situation, but in this one, that was the primary reason we were protecting that land, was so that people could get out there and use it. So really a wide array of reasons why to protect, and a lot of flexibility that can be built into that.
So people are using your land. There must be insurance that has to be provided for liability. So is that landowner or the trust?
Yeah, so if it's a conservation easement and the landowner still owns the property, it's really the landowner's liability. I mean, there is actually a surprising amount of liability protection in the state of New Hampshire. I don't really understand. I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to do a poor job explaining it, but
you don't have to have public.
Right.
You don't have to have a public.
Oh, you certainly don't. And even if you allow the public, or it's required in your conservation easement to allow the public to walk on your land, you don't necessarily have liability for them if they do something that's frivolous, or if they get hurt on your property. In New Hampshire, and it's through Fish and Game Department, because New Hampshire has had such a long tradition of hunting and not posting land and allowing people to move across properties. There are very strong liability protections for landowners unless they've actually created something that is dangerous, and they've charged money for someone to be there.
I found that out too on my property too, when I was willed property from my parents, and I asked my attorney, I says, am I liable for people walking across even though I don't have it posted? And he said, unless you put, you know, if you had a path through there and all of a sudden you put a cable across, or you dug a trench, you know, and you made some sort of physical a barrier or something where somebody could get hurt, that's the only time you would be liable for anything like that without, you know, any caution signs or anything that would be in the case. But by and large, I mean, when you have open land, there's no way you're gonna, that much land, you're gonna be able to police it yourself. So people are gonna walk across it and people are gonna cross over it. And sometimes hunters will come through the land, and you know what? There's not much you can do about that, but and you're not really liable. If they're gonna trip and fall and hurt themselves, you're not gonna be liable for that, because they really aren't supposed to be there without, you know, without your permission or whatever, so. I guess.
But in the case, you know, SELT does own land, and certainly if we were to do something that was frivolous and putting people in danger, and we were actually charging them to be on the land, and certainly there could be liability there. But
Well, then you can have insurance for it too.
Yeah.
You could have insurance for something like that.
I'd like that,
Sorry, go right ahead.
like the Bodwell property over there, I'd like to walk around, go out and back. I don't even know if it's something that we're allowed to do. How do you find that out?
yeah, so I mean, the other beautiful thing about New Hampshire, if there aren't posted signs every 50 feet along the boundary, you can walk right across that boundary. So there's the responsibility is on the landowner to post. And if it's not posted, you have a right to walk right across.
Right, I have two Zoom questions. The first one kind of goes off of what Vicky had asked about deeds, and it says, what if two people own a piece of property and one person wants to do a conservation easement and the other does not, but is willing to alter the deed to not allow building? Is that something that can be done and still have it protected just without UV oversight?
So that, it sounds more like a deed restriction that they're describing. And again, in that case, while that may restrict the property in the here and now, further down the road, if there isn't a third party to enforce that restriction, then I would say it may not serve the purpose in perpetuity.
Yeah, and I can add to that, just an example of a property that I visit with a naturalist in Mass. The Mary Cummings Park in Burlington, Mass, and Woburn was willed by a woman, 300 acres, was willed to the city of Boston for the purpose of people in the area being able to use it. And after she died, the city of Boston, which owned it and was supposed to be honoring her will, was a deed restriction, specifically used the money from her will and her estate to actually try to go over and beyond the deed restriction. And it took the flyers that were doing model airplanes and the hikers and the bikers and the people in the area to fight it, because the city of Boston was trying to sell it and basically make money on it. And, you know, they didn't care if it was sold to a developer, but they didn't want to manage it. So fortunately, the trustees of the reservations is big in Massachusetts, and they, with people bought it. But that's an example to me that a deed restriction is not a good idea if you really want to protect it forever.
All right, so my other one is, when you come out for a yearly inspection, do you do surprise visits or do you plan them with and do you fly like drones over them to double check what's going on to the harbor?
No, we absolutely call the landowner and let them know. It's, you know, it's kind of a nice annual reminder that we're here, but no, we do not do surprise visits. And we actually don't use drones right now. I mean, it's something that the conservation community is talking about and thinking about. But, you know, what I like to tell people is those annual visits are just as much, if not more, to walk the boundary and make sure that the neighbors aren't doing things that they shouldn't be doing, as they are checking in on the landowner. Because most of the time, the landowner has a good conservation ethic and intent. It's really the properties around it that you may have to be making sure that they're not, you know, crossing over and doing things that they shouldn't be.
for a relatively small property, like 25 acres, where do you start to get, you know, an easement going? Who can hold it? I'm concerned about having my town hold the easement, because it really is policed by volunteers and politics and stuff like that. So does a land trust, you know, take on small backyard easements or
Yeah.
something like that?
Well, what I encourage everyone to do is to reach out to the land trust. I'll be honest, we are really backlogged with interest in conservation easements. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. And what we do is there's no property that's too small, to answer your question. But really what we do is we try to zoom out a little bit. There's lots of information about the property, you know, from New Hampshire Fish and Game about wildlife habitat, or the New Hampshire Coastal Plan has prioritized the entire coastal watershed for conservation. So there are lots of things that we can know and understand about how important a property is from a conservation perspective. You know, I hate to say it, but just sitting in our office looking at geographic information systems, GIS. So that's how we start the process, is we get a bird's eye view and just a general kind of check-in on how important is this property from a conservation perspective. And if it's important, then 25 acres is not too small, not even close. I'm working on a 9-acre farm in Londonderry right now. You know, Londonderry is getting really built out. So a 9-acre farm in Londonderry is actually a really significant conservation project. So it all depends on where your property is in the greater landscape context. And if it's important, then we'll work with you on it. And if it's not, then, you know, we can't conserve every property. And the fact that we're so backlogged is we really have to make sure that we're working on the highest priority projects at any given time, because the seacoast is getting developed so fast that, you know, we talked about it. We may only have another 25, 30 years of protecting land before land's either conserved or built on. There's a clock ticking, and, you know, the economy and everything else has an impact on how fast that goes. But, you know, we try to think as long-term as we can, and 25 acres, believe me, is not too small to protect if it's important.
And we've done that in our town with our map system too, in abutting towns as well, as far as identifying not just the wetlands, but identifying wildlife corridors between towns, and having a development come through that's going to impact that wildlife corridor is certainly important. We had one recently in town here in the past couple of years where they were going to do a major subdivision. It didn't get done, but one of the factors that we as the Conservation Commission did was identify where it was located. It was in the middle of one of our conservation wildlife corridors, where deer and all kinds of birds and wildlife just travel back and forth. So that's a high priority, that what we felt as though that it would really impact that area.
So how did you counteract that development?
Well, we can't prevent development. There's no way you can prevent development. But when it does get developed, you can make recommendations to the planning board to say that perhaps the houses should be maybe separated to maintain a corridor of some sort. So within the development itself, you can try to make suggestions as to how it gets built. But there really isn't any, as far as a conservation commission is concerned, we can't really make or make suggestions above and beyond what the rules are.
Right.
So you can't really stop development if someone or anybody wants to develop their property, but the same token, there's a lot of sentimental value that I have on my property, and I would really want to put a conservation easement on my property and someday, and it's going to happen. But And it's just because I have a lot of sentimental value to my property. I mean, I walk it all the time, and the history that I have in my property it means a lot to me.
Right.
And I'd like to have it preserved. And so, and that, I think there's a lot of people that feel that way.
Right.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, that in East Kingston, we just two years ago passed a warrant article that the cluster subdivisions, which are created in town, if there is a cluster of condos or houses, whatever, they have to have 50% open space around them. So if they're in an area where there's a wildlife border, there still will be a way for the wildlife to get through it. There'll still be some open space. And as Dennis said, we're also looking at properties in town, some of which you own, and trying to evaluate their priority based on conservation values, as Jeremy mentioned. So in that particular case, the conservation concern about this being a very important property was one of the factors that was used by the planning board to say no, and it didn't go through. But it wasn't the only factor. There was a safety issue as well.
Yeah.
So,
I was gonna
but,
say that.
yeah, I mean, it wasn't the only
laws are
factor.
laws and-
I mean, let's face it, we need development too. We still need development, but we need to balance the development with, logical housing areas with conservation as well. Or as you said, 25 years, it'll all just be developed. So.
Yeah, and that's one of the misconceptions I always try to correct when I'm out and about. A lot of people think land trusts are anti-development. We're actually not. We're just for smart development and smart growth. Putting the houses where the houses should be, leaving the wildlife habitat intact where it should be, keeping the farms on the best farmland soils. There are a lot of different mixed uses across a landscape, and I think what's most important is deciding where each component should be or where it needs. In the case of farmland, I can't tell you how many people I work with that don't understand that the soils that are there are not all created equal. And a place like Bodwell Dairy Farm, the reason we were able to fund that project is because the soils are prime agricultural soils, and New Hampshire doesn't have a lot of that. So, if we want to be able to grow some of our own food 100 years from now, we have to protect those prime agricultural soils, because you're not going to be able to have the same level of production on soils that aren't prime. You just could work so much harder for such little production. So you really have to think about what the priorities are across the landscape and try to protect the ones that you can. And the other thing that I sort of didn't answer about your question, we have worked with families or landowners before that just didn't want to involve the Conservation Commission or the town because they didn't want their conservation easement to get sort of involved with town politics. That's entirely the landowner's choice. And conservation commissions are oftentimes our best partners. But if you came to me at the land trust and told me that you didn't want to involve the Conservation Commission, my lips would be sealed. That's confidential information you're sharing with me, and I would ask if I could reach out to the Conservation Commission. And you guys if you live in East Kingston, you're fortunate. You have a really great Conservation Commission. But it's true, not all are created equal, and sometimes conservation commissions can get kind of pulled in a political direction. So I can understand some apprehension, with some landowners about that.
Yeah, I want to kind of clarify that. I'm from Chester and I'm on the Conservation Commission. I see external forces with politics, potential, people don't necessarily see the value of the town owning land and having it being open. And so the concern that I have is that down the road, if the political atmosphere is such that there's already too much open land, what's to prevent politics from taking over and picking and choosing which part?
If you do a conservation easement, then there wouldn't be any political changes that would take place.
Yeah, but then you still have to have somebody that, in our town, we have, we purchase land, we put easements on it, and then we're still the people that are doing the easement monitoring, and we're all volunteers. And So unless you have somebody who's dedicated to doing the monitoring, things can slip through the cracks that are irreversible. So
Did that change, Jeremy? Can the monitoring change from the town to another entity?
It can, you know, there are some communities and conservation commissions, like I said, back in the late 80s and 90s and early 2000s, conservation commissions were really protecting a lot of land because they didn't understand how much responsibility and how much of a burden, frankly, it can be to monitor that much land. And so we do have some communities that contract with us to allow us to do the monitoring for them. But I've heard that concern from landowners before, just feeling like, you know, if the town is holding the conservation easement and they wanted to interpret a certain restriction a certain way as, you know, to be vindictive or payback or some kind of political whatever. The one thing I do say to people is conservation easements are actually overseen by the Attorney General's office in New Hampshire, the charitable trust unit. It's seen as essentially a charitable trust, and just like the Attorney General has to uphold something that is bequeathed through a will or through a charitable contribution, they have to uphold these conservation easements ultimately. So if a town got too crooked, for lack of a better word, and the landowner pushed back, ultimately they would find that conversation at the Attorney General's and charitable trust unit. So there is some built-in protection even above the town and municipal level with conservation easements.
yeah, I'm just looking for like, when I'm gone and nobody's there to watch out for it, you gotta have somebody.
Yep.
You know, that has a vested interest in conservation versus any other motivation. So
Yep.
I trust land trusts over any other entity to watch out for, you know, the property. So.
Yep. And the other thing that's worth explaining is oftentimes, so if we work with a conservation commission and they contribute funds to a project, in many cases, it's required that the municipality or the conservation commission hold an interest in the easement. But that interest in the easement can be a variety of interests. It can be a right of enforcement, which in let's just use their example. They had a right of enforcement and they felt like the land trust wasn't enforcing something, they could step in and enforce it. But there are other executory interests that are just what we call backup interest. And that basically says the Conservation Commission can only step in and enforce the conservation easement if the land trust were to dissolve or go away. So there are kind of different levels sometimes, and it does depend on the town and what their either preference or legal requirements are in terms of that interest. So.
Let me just add to, if all of you are here because you care about your land or doing conservation easements, this is available. This is this map is a PDF. You can zoom in on your property and it will show you all these natural resources. And if you're able to arm yourself and say, look, I have significant wildlife habitat for the state here. I have a wildlife corridor here. I'm next to conservation area here. It can be prioritized when someone like SELT is looking at it, or SPINIT or whoever. There's a new one that's out that Jeremy mentioned called the New Hampshire Coastal Conservation Plan. And it wonderfully identifies those rich soils and actually has outlined the areas for agriculture that we all want to make sure we conserve for the future. So unfortunately, I'm not in the same GIS layer map, but I can get that to you too. Or like this one's available on our website. You can scan the.
Do you have some of those maps up there?
I have two right now. I can hand out two. I can email it to you, whatever. And the agricultural one, I can also send you a PDF. And again, it looks tiny here, but the resolution is such, if you zoom in on your address, you'll be able to see it in great detail. And you'll see what's conserved around you, et cetera. And this is available for every community in New Hampshire and Maine and part of Mass. So you can go online and again, I can help you find that. I'm sure you have it, Deb Chester. But yeah, so we have this. This is a great resource. somebody who was here in June.
I want to
is
see it
working-
before I leave.
and somebody who was here in June is working with SELT now, with her property. And was able to use some of the features that are on this to talk about why that property was valuable. Plus, it's also a recreational value too in that particular case for the community, but, so.
Right, I have one question, quick question. Matt asks, does SELT ever need volunteers to work on cleaning and maintaining their trails?
Yes. So we have a growing volunteer program, so I'd encourage them to reach out. The person that they would want to first get in touch with is named Zoe.
Oh, cool.
And then
You'll
she'll-
remember that one. Since it's Zoe too.
Yeah.
Zoe will remember that. Yeah. And also another thing, if you want to, tell Matt, if you want to do volunteer work like that, naturegroupie.org, I think, has all these volunteer opportunities listed on it. So you can, count baby oysters, and you can plant plants, and you can clean trails, and all those kinds of training and volunteer activities are on there, and it's kind of one place you can go to find ways to help in your community.
Yes. I have a question in reference to somebody that talked about conservation or land trust being wild, or if I have a lot of conservation around my property. Okay, so my property fits right in the middle. Okay. So if I was to take a big portion of my property to donate, say, to conservation or to a land trust, what is done with this property? Like, does this property get logged? Or does it get maintained as wild? Or what happens with this property?
Yeah, I mean, that is a conversation that you would have. Oftentimes, even if a property is in our service area, let's just say the conservation around you is either owned or the conservation easement is held by the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. We would probably encourage you to reach out to them because they have the abutting properties. And it really depends on what the land trust goals and objectives might be for the property, but it would be a conversation. It wouldn't be a, this is what we're gonna do. I mean, if you're making a donation of land, a lot of that priority and objectives would be coming from, what you wanted. So, yeah, but I would encourage you to reach out. Like I said, you can have conversations freely, and none of that conversation obliges you to, move forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you never know until you ask.
Right, exactly.
Jeremy, you mentioned something about if you had two parcels in two separate names, two abutting parcels. What if you have one large parcel and it's in two separate towns?
The town boundary does not have an impact on the conservation easement. Yeah. In fact, it's fairly common for us to do a conservation easement across two towns. The one thing that you do have to keep in mind, and I wish I had a mind that I could memorize the RSA to reference, but going back to the comment I made about a town needing to hold an interest in the property, that's a requirement that comes from the enabling statute of conservation commissions. And there are ways that the Conservation Commission, through a town meeting or through a town ballot, can contribute funds to a project, even if it's not within their town boundary, or if they're not getting an interest in the conservation easement. But those actually have to be affirmed by voters, not for each project, but voters have to affirm that once within the town. I say that because it could have implications. Let's just say your property ran across three towns. One town might only be able to contribute a portion on which that town is covered. And the interest that town may hold, let's just say it goes from across Exeter and Kensington. The town of Exeter, if they contribute funds to it, they may only be able to enforce the easement on the portion that's in Exeter. So it sort of gets broken down by municipality most often. But yeah, absolutely. You can do one conservation easement across town boundaries. Yep.
One more.
Okay.
He writes, the golf course on the East Kingston line is up for sale, is there any plan for the two towns or SELT or RCCC to try and acquire the 113 acres?
I hadn't heard that. Golf courses can be tricky because they're often highly manipulated, just in terms of the vegetation and everything else. But if there were an interested party that wanted to own that property or was able to bring that to the land trust's attention, it's certainly something we'd look at. I often tell people, I work with farmers a lot, young farmers that are leasing land, and I may get a call where a young farmer says, "Oh, I just saw this awesome farm that came up for sale. It'd be a great conservation opportunity," and I look at it, and it is a great opportunity. If that property is already on the market, chances are there is no way we're going to be able to put a conservation project together, raise the funds, conserve the property before someone else has got it under contract and it's long gone. So that's the difficult aspect of seeing a property that's listed. Oftentimes, there's just no way we can mobilize.
We have not been contacted. The Conservation Commission, East Kingston, hasn't been contacted by the owners of that property about doing any type of easement. So, yeah.
And neither has the Conservation Commission in Kingston,
In
which is
Kingston,
where
right.
the property is based. As 30 of those 113 acres are in East Kingston and the rest are in
Most
Kingston.
of it's in
So,
Kingston.
yeah.
Yeah, it would really, at this point, it would entirely be decided by the existing landowner. And if they were to sell it, we will sometimes just through the grapevine approach that new landowner and say, hey, just so you know, your property is a priority, and see if the conversation goes anywhere. But more often than not, the conservation commissions in each town are kind of the eyes and ears. And if they see an opportunity, sometimes they'll reach out and let us know. But without that nudge, we can't keep track of everything that's on the market, unfortunately.
Any other questions from anybody? A lot of information to digest. Thank you, Jeremy, for presenting this stuff. And certainly if there's any questions to Conservation Commission in East Kingston or any other towns, or Jeremy, I'm sure you're willing to answer any questions by anybody. If people talk to your abutters or anybody else in the town, certainly we can answer any questions that you have and hopefully work toward our goals of preserving more land in town.
And we have a website, so if you ever want to reach out, get a hold of me, just find my contact info there and give me a call. Good to see you guys.